Around the world, September's been a massive month for countries and companies demoing new military equipment. Tens of thousands of people made their way to London for the DSCI exhibition. I was one of them. And Russia staged an impromptu drone tech demo over Poland. We'll talk about both of those soon enough. But before either of those, eyes of analysts around the world turned to China, where the People's Liberation Army marked what it calls the 80th anniversary of the victory of the Chinese People's War of Resistance against Japanese aggression and the World Anti-Fascist War by showing off a huge array of military systems, many of which had never been seen in public before. And so today I'm going to zoom in on just some of what Beijing decided to show off to the world and ask what it might tell us about the progress of China's military modernisation speedrun. To do that, we'll start with everyone's favourite, the background and caveats, why this parade happened, what it can tell us and what it can't tell us. And then we're going to move on to the medal. With so much having been shown off, I'm going to focus on 4 themes that I think are worth a closer look: nuclear forces, next-generation armour, counter-drone systems, and naval aviation. And for each of those, talk a little bit about what we saw, what it means, and why that might matter. Then at the end, we'll zoom out for a bit of a big-picture look, asking not just what we saw during this particular parade, but what we know about PLA modernisation more broadly, and what that might mean for how we think about China as a major military power, both now and going into the future. Okay, let's start context. Why did China just show off a bunch of new military equipment, and how should we interpret that? The first thing to say is that this was an event of deep political significance. The 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, or as Chinese media puts it in English, the 80th anniversary of the victory in the Chinese People's War of Resistance against Japanese aggression and the World Anti-Fascist War. That makes it a parade, a demonstration, not a military exercise. And so I think it's important as we go through the various equipment that was shown or not shown, to give some thought as to why that decision might have been made from a political and narrative-shaping perspective. Essentially, don't assume that every high-significant system was shown off at this parade, or that every system showed off at this parade was of high significance. In terms of what was showed off, there was a lot of variance in terms of where these systems were on their development and introduction journey. Some of this was stuff that we've known to be in service in reasonable numbers for years at this point, while in other cases, these were systems we were seeing for the first time. Given that, a lot of the coverage I've seen of this event flags the need to acknowledge some of the unknowns here. As with any military parade or trade show, just because a piece of equipment was showed off doesn't necessarily guarantee that it performs as its data sheet or media release might suggest, nor that it's available or in service in large numbers. Indeed, if being in a parade was proof that a piece of equipment was everything a government said it was, then by now the T-14 Armata would be the standard tank of the Russian ground forces. There's also always going to be a limit on how much technical information you can confidently gather based just on a parade drive-by. Many of China's new missile systems, for example, like the DF-61 or the CJ-1000, were displayed in canisters on their TELs, their transporter erector launchers. In cases like that, we can see what Beijing says about a particular system, but ultimately we can't see inside the canister, we haven't observed these systems being test-fired, and so there's always a chance that there's some smoke mirrors or exaggeration involved. That being the caveat though, I want to stick an asterisk on the asterisk, because one of my concerns with some of the coverage I've seen around Chinese military developments is the tendency to sometimes move from healthy skepticism of those capabilities to dismissal of them. If I was to create a generalised flowchart of what you might call China dismissal syndrome, when it comes to military equipment, it might go something like this. Firstly, it starts with the assertion that China couldn't possibly build that type of system. Say, an aircraft carrier, for example, they can only buy it in from abroad. Often those assessments might attach to things that historically are particularly difficult from an industrial perspective, like high-performance jet engines for fighters. Then, of course, China goes on to build one. Once China builds something, the assertion might be that it's just an inferior copy of something else. We've seen that logic attached to a lot of Chinese-built versions of Soviet and later Russian military equipment. The 2 rebuttals to that would probably be that first, something doesn't have to be original in order to be very effective, and secondly, we have plenty of precedent for Chinese derivatives improving on the original design. Speaking of Chinese fighters back in 2020, for example, RUSI observed that, quote, the J-16 and J-11D are evidence that Chinese derivatives have now surpassed Russian-built flankers, with superior multi-role capabilities, longer-ranged and more effective missiles, and operational IESA radars, end quote. But hey, the argument might go, it's still a derivative. It doesn't reflect an original Chinese design. Until original Chinese designs are fielded, and there are plenty of them at this point, at which point you reach the assertion that the system probably doesn't work, or at the very least it isn't battle-tested. And in some cases it may be true, but that doesn't make it a safe or reasonable assumption to assume that anything that isn't battle-proven can't or doesn't perform to spec. When the export version of China's PL-15 air-to-air missile was used in the recent fighting between Pakistan and India, for example, it appears to have proven itself to be a very dangerous missile with a long reach. Missile ranges are obviously very murky and always context dependent, but it was generally reported that PL-15E, the version Pakistan had a range of about 145 kilometres. And reports citing Indian officials suggest that they thought the threat range was about 150 kilometres. But during some of the air combat we saw, it's reported PL-15 may have been used beyond that range, including in a claimed incident reported on by Reuters involving the engagement of an Indian Air Force Rafale. According to that Reuters report, quote, the PL-15 that hit the Rafale was fired from around 200 kilometres away, according to Pakistani officials, and even further according to Indian officials. With RUSI's Justin Bronk noting that, quote, the Indians were not expecting to be shot at, and the PL-15 is clearly very capable at long range, end quote. Which served as a bit of a reminder that when you're not sure about the exact performance of a system, it might be the case that the adversary is understating rather than overstating what it can actually do. And given the enormous success of Chinese manufacturers across so many fields, it seems very strange to me to be surprised every time China produces capable equipment, and the potential adversaries or competitors would generally be much better off, assuming that when China sets out in a serious way to solve a particular technical problem or design a particular piece of equipment, given their resources and capabilities, they're probably eventually going to get there. And so while it's certainly possible that some of the equipment we go through today might not be as operational or as effective as is sometimes claimed, in my opinion, any comments saying that this is a fiberglass force are demonstrably wrong, and China's military modernisation is a very real effort, backed by the largest manufacturing base on the planet. It needs to be treated with respect and evaluated as such. There are a couple of reasons then that a parade like this might be useful to us as observers. It might give us clues about the direction Chinese military equipment development is heading, how they perceive their strategic challenges or the future of the battlefield, and what solutions or equipment they're pursuing to address them. With the pace China's military has been modernising, today's concept, prototype, or low-rate initial production example with some technical rough edges can pretty quickly become a mass-produced cornerstone of the PLA's inventory. Essentially, it makes sense to pay attention to what's displayed today to gather some clues about what might be deployed tomorrow. So for the first equipment category to get a detailed look, let's talk nukes. You could argue that all arms of the Chinese military are going through rapid equipment transformation, but in terms of raw qualitative and quantitative growth, not much can compete with the Chinese nuclear forces. While China's been a nuclear weapon state since the mid-1960s, it spent the overwhelming majority of that time with one of the smaller global inventories. A 2015 RAND report assessed that in 1996, 2003 or 2010, if the United States had launched a first strike against China's nuclear forces, China would only have had a low confidence in its nuclear second strike capability, meaning they may have got few, if any, shots off in response. In 2021, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists estimated the Chinese nuclear inventory at about 350 warheads. In terms of raw numbers, that put it ahead of, but in the same ballpark as countries like the United Kingdom or France. By 2025, there were more missiles in the force that could reach the United States, and the estimated warhead count now started with a 6. While the ground leg was scaling up though, both in terms of numbers and reach, the air and naval elements of China's nuclear forces were significantly more limited. The aircraft in PLAAF inventory that presumably would have been responsible for delivering any airdrop nuclear weapon was the H-6 bomber, a non-stealthy subsonic aircraft based on the Soviet Tupolev-16, which entered service in the 1950s. Not exactly the kind of thing you might trust to carry nuclear weapons deep into enemy territory. The naval arm was considerably better, anchored on a fleet of 6 active Type 94 SSBNs, with the potential weakness from a deterrence perspective not being so much the submarines themselves, but the missile they carried. The main system in Chinese service, the JL-2, reportedly has a range of about 7,000 kilometres, which is a bloody long way, but not, as you can see on the map here, enough to enable a Chinese submarine to get a warhead to, for example, the United States west coast from Chinese waters. To get in range, they'd obviously need to patrol out further, but doing so might impose risks that could potentially undermine Beijing's confidence in its second strike capability. The nuclear delivery systems that China showed off at the parade provide a pretty clear steer, I'd argue, on some of the ways China is trying to address these potential strategic shortfalls. We saw a new submarine-launched ballistic missile, JL-3, which is a very similar form factor to JL-2, since it's meant to fit to the same missile launch tubes, but which is reportedly meant to have a range closer to 10,000 kilometres, meaning that, according to one US military assessment, it would give the PRC the, quote, ability to target the continental United States from littoral waters, end quote. And in that sense, you could argue this mirrors the development we've seen from the French nuclear forces, who've also moved towards a longer-range submarine-launched ballistic missile, again with the potential benefit of enabling their ballistic missile submarines to provide survivable second strike from much safer waters. So that's the submarine survivability problem potentially covered. What about the Air Force? Because until China is actually able to field its next-generation stealth bomber, the H-20, the H-6 is what they got. And as a general rule, if you're trying to make an aircraft survivable, but can't make it either stealthy or quick, the remaining go-to option is generally standoff, which is potentially where this thing comes in, the JL-1 air-launched ballistic missile. ALBMs are not strictly a new concept. The US was developing this thing, the Skybolt, during the Cold War, and China's already believed to have given their H-6s access to a smaller conventional anti-ship ballistic missile. But if equipped with a nuclear warhead, as many analysts assess it might be, what JL-1 would potentially do is give the H-6 the ability to deliver nuclear strikes from beyond the ability of most targets to respond. And while new systems like this might provide a significant leg up to the air and naval arms of China's nuclear triad, that doesn't mean we didn't see anything for the traditionally dominant ground leg, far from it. For example, China's heavy liquid-fueled silo-based ICBM, the DF-5, appears to be getting a new version. While extremely difficult to verify, as frankly a lot of this is going to be, one of the key generally assessed upgrade areas is going to be range, with Chinese state media claiming this thing has the capacity to reach out 20,000 kilometres or more than 12,000 miles, at which point the system is essentially an everywhere from anywhere weapon. In numerical terms though, DF-5 is not the backbone of the current Chinese ICBM fleet, and there are plenty of reasons you wouldn't want it to be. It's very big, it's very heavy, it's very expensive, and it comes with some of the limitations inherent to liquid-fueled missiles. Historically, liquid-fueled missiles are a bit of a pain to work with. Rocket fuels are unpleasant materials to deal with in general, and historical liquid-fueled designs couldn't be kept fueled for long periods, and could take a significant period of time to fuel up when it came time to make them ready for launch. It's claimed that DF-5C may have made improvements in this area, so it can be kept in a ready state more of the time, but the general expectation is that it will remain a relatively specialised part of the Chinese ICBM fleet and not be universally deployed across all the new missile silos that China's been in the process of building. Instead, it's generally expected that a lot of the hundreds of new silos that China has been constructing are going to be filled with solid-fueled missiles. Potentially this system, which we saw in public for the first time during the parade, DF-31BJ, with it being reported that J in the designation likely stands for the word Jing, literally meaning well, but which has been used by the PLA to describe missile silos. So DF-31, version B, silo variant. And then finally rounding out this section, we had a new road mobile ICBM, DF-61. Now, as you can see on the right there, the visual differences between the DF-61 TEL we saw in 2025 and the DF-41 TEL we first saw in 2019 basically comes down to a change in paint job. That makes any attempt to guess about potential improvements in performance based on the physical features alone pretty much dead on arrival. Without the power of the wire behind you, you can't just paint something a different colour in order to make it faster or go further. But for what it's worth, Chinese sources claim that this system has the kind of capabilities you might expect, basically providing the same capability for China that RS-24 does for Russia. In terms of the ground-based missiles, the overwhelming focus here was on the ICBMs. The stuff that could potentially cover the distance from the Chinese mainland to the continental United States, rather than China's more intermediate range regional delivery systems. As for the potential motives behind that decision, or what it might be intended to signal, I'll happily leave to the audience. Because instead, I want to close out this nuclear section by essentially asking, what does this mean and why does it potentially matter? In terms of the what, even if we hadn't seen these systems, I'd argue the overall pattern is fairly clear. The PRC is building towards a full, mature nuclear triad. Its confidence in its ability to launch a survivable second strike, even in the face of a counterforce first strike, is likely to be growing, and its ability to deliver warheads, especially over very long distances, to targets, for example, in Europe or the continental United States, is significantly growing. And the pacing here is pretty stark when you compare it to, for example, the United States. After years of delays and cost overruns, the first missiles are now expected to enter service in the 2030s. And the Government Accountability Office has suggested the Air Force take a look at the possibility of keeping the Minuteman III, which entered service in the 1970s, in service to at least some degree, out to the year 2050. While there are obviously some complexities involved, I think it does give some sense of perspective to the breadth and speed of China's ICBM development and deployment efforts. Overall, you could argue essentially that if there were tiers of nuclear weapon states, China would be in the process of trying to move between two of them. If it was previously the case that it was clearly Russia and the United States on top, with China more a peer of the likes of France and the United Kingdom, China is now probably somewhere in between those two categories, still a long way from being a peer of the two nuclear superpowers, but with the rate its warhead inventory has been growing, the gap is certainly narrowing. And even if all the powers involved, hopefully, have the intention of never actually using their nuclear inventories, that potentially has strategic implications. By narrowing the nuclear balance between the PRC and the United States, it might leave Beijing feeling more strategically confident. I'd argue Russia has been very effectively able to use the threat or perceived threat of nuclear escalation to control Western intervention in Ukraine, deterring Allied states from intervening directly and also gating the types and quantities of weapons provided, especially in the critical years of 2022 and 2023. And it might be that some in Beijing believe that a stronger nuclear arsenal might encourage their potential adversaries to self-deter in that same way. It also potentially helps future-proof Chinese military capabilities against American investments in ballistic missile defense. As we covered in our episode on the Golden Dome, in general, when it comes to missile defense, the offense is much cheaper than the defense. And so while it might have been plausible that with significant investment, eventually the United States could develop a missile defense capability that would have been sufficient to hold back the nuclear capability of, say, China in the early 2000s, by adding many more warheads and types of delivery systems to the force the way they're doing, it probably becomes incredibly unlikely that the American missile defense system would ever get to the point where it was good enough to rob the Chinese nuclear force of its deterrent value. The third point is what this might potentially mean for the international system of nuclear arms control, which, frankly, was already in pretty rough shape. With a couple of exceptions, like the NNPT itself, most of the major agreements on things like warhead counts and delivery systems have been negotiated as bilateral agreements, either between the United States and Soviet Union or the United States and Russian Federation. The system wasn't designed, frankly, with China as a major nuclear player in mind, and there are currently no agreements between Beijing and Washington restricting things like delivery system or warhead count. The reason that's potentially problematic is because it provides yet another pressure on the treaties that do exist. If you're the United States and you're party to an agreement with Russia, which limits your warhead count, but China is rapidly expanding its forces, then that might provide an incentive for you to pull out of those agreements so you can build up your forces and maintain a level of nuclear advantage. With the New START agreement due to expire in early 2026, that's not an irrelevant consideration. If you subscribe to the radical view that large-scale nuclear buildups are generally not a great thing for humanity, then that dynamic might be of some concern. If you're India, for example, and China builds up its nuclear forces to counterbalance the United States, then from New Delhi's perspective, the discrepancy between China and India's nuclear forces is going to widen. That might encourage India to invest in increasing its warhead counts and diversifying its delivery systems, which might restore the balance vis-a-vis China somewhat, but at the same time, it would shift the balance between, say, India and Pakistan. And so the effects of any build-up might ripple out and have an impact on global inventories, not just Chinese ones. Which brings this back to the final point of why this matters. China isn't just diversifying and modernising its delivery systems, it is, as we noted earlier, adding a lot more warheads. At the start of the 2020s, it was estimated that China had about 350. The current figure is north of 600, and US estimates suggest that by 2030 it will be over 1,000. And while that might give us a pretty clear sense of the rate of change, it doesn't give us a clear idea of where the intended endpoint is. It's clear based on what we saw at the parade that China is building towards having a very modern, diversified, capable nuclear triad. What isn't clear yet is just how big they intend that triad to be. Moving on from the nuclear to the conventional then, let's talk ground combat systems. Because over the course of the parade, we saw a lot of metal on display. At the head of the parade, for example, was nothing too radical, a new upgrade package for China's Type 99 main battle tank. For reasons that'll become clear in just a moment, you might think of this as the heavy MBT of the Chinese military, but it's certainly not heavy by Western standards. In its A variant, it tipped the scales at about 55 tonnes, more than 10 less than recent model Leopard 2s, for example, but notably heavier than recent model Russian tanks, at least those that didn't have half a residential building welded to them. That China would continue to upgrade the Type 99 isn't surprising. The first tanks are believed to have entered service in 2001, the first A models in 2011, and so by global standards this is still a pretty young fleet that the PLA is likely to keep in service for years to come. But while this might be one of the newer main battle tank designs globally, it's still distinctly a third generation MBT. The layout and main gun, for example, aren't that different from what you might see on a T-72. And so at the parade, the tanks catching all the attention weren't the Type 99s, it was the vehicles behind them. This is what China is calling a fourth generation MBT, the Type 100. And based on what we've been told about its features, I'd argue that's probably a fair designation. There's no international umpire defining exactly what does or doesn't make a fourth generation main battle tank, but Type 100 appears to feature a bunch of the ones that regularly come up. It has a hybrid electric drive system for increased fuel efficiency, the ability to operate more quietly, with the added advantage of making it much easier to have a lot of electrical energy available for any power-hungry systems that you want to bolt onto the vehicle. And in that respect, the vehicle appears to be covered in sensors. The crew is shown wearing what have been claimed to be augmented reality goggles, which is a feature we've seen on some Western armoured vehicles to give crew the ability to have essentially a 360-degree view even while within the vehicle, and then an interesting combination of offensive, defensive, and layout features. In terms of layout, the tank appears to have an almost T-14 Armata-style arrangement, an unmanned turret, and all the crew we did see nested in the hull of the vehicle. The top of the turret mounts a remote weapon station, but also 8 tubes for China's GL6 active protection system, suggesting this might be a vehicle that leans comparatively more on active as opposed to traditional passive defences, that is, its armour. That might be particularly relevant because in terms of size and weight, it appears Chinese designers here have gone for something smaller than Type 99. In part because of the nature of its terrain, there are certainly sections of the Chinese frontier where you'd struggle to get a full-size main battle tank. China is one of the major militaries out there that currently operates both a main battle tank and a light tank. This is China's Type 15, estimated to weigh somewhere between 33 and 36 tonnes, that's believed to have entered service in 2018. Type 100 is generally assessed to be heavier than that, somewhere in the 40-tonne range, but still significantly smaller than the heavier Type 99. And to confuse its position in the main battle tank-light tank divide even more, the main gun appears to be only a 105mm, which is significantly smaller than the 125mm used by the Type 99, the 120mm used by most NATO tanks, and instead more in line with the 105mm used on the Type 15. In that respect, you could argue Type 100 appears to kitbash a bunch of different ideas together. It's in the same weight range and firepower category as the American M10 Booker, has a layout more akin to a T-14 Armata, and the kind of sensors, active protection and information systems that you'll see on a bunch of modern Western AFE concepts. And critically, unlike those first two, it doesn't appear to have been cancelled. Another interesting observation about Type 100 is that it was followed by a second type of vehicle that appears to use the same basic hull. This is what's being called the Type 100 support vehicle, and it appears to follow essentially an infantry fighting vehicle style layout. You have an unmanned turret with an autocannon armament, again a bunch of sensors, an active protection system, and generally a lot of the features you'd expect on a modern vehicle design of this type. From a manufacturing and sustainment standpoint, there are plenty of reasons you might want to build multiple types of vehicles on the same basic platform. The United States planned to do it with their Future Combat Systems program. Russia planned to do it with the T-14. The Israelis currently do this with their heavy Namir APC, based on the Merkava 4 tank chassis, and the PLA appears to be trying to do it with these 2 new middleweight armoured vehicles. On seeing these vehicles, there's a few immediate questions that stand out. There are obvious ones around questions of exact technical maturity or how many have been built so far, but I think the more interesting ones for me are going to be doctrinal. Who gets these? You already have units that get the regular MBTs or the lighter Type 15, so I think it'll be interesting to see who the ultimate customer for this mobile protected fire system if you're from the US Army, or medium tank if you're anyone else, ultimately turns out to be. Much less ambiguous, I'd argue, is who the ultimate customers for the next category of vehicles are going to be. Because we also saw the PLA show off 3 next-generation airborne AFEs. So I think it's fair to suggest those will go to the section of the Chinese military that's happy to throw people and equipment out the back of perfectly functional aircraft. Now, before we look at the vehicles themselves, there's an important piece of context to note here. The PLA's airborne forces already have an airdroppable IFE. You can see it on the right there. It's a very light BMD-style vehicle, designation ZBD-03. By the armour and weight standards of military vehicles, the Type 03 isn't that many steps removed from a particularly angry go-kart. The weight's about 8 tonnes, the primary armament's a 30mm cannon, and like the Russian BMD, the protection scheme against anything larger than small arms is primarily based on a thick shell of hopes and dreams. But more than a decade after the Chinese airborne got their first Type 03s, the PLA started to receive this thing, the Y-20. This is the PLA's strategic airlifter, a rough equivalent to the Boeing C-17. And while its introduction has had major implications for the lift capacity of the Chinese force overall, for the airborne specifically, it opens up the option of lifting and potentially dropping larger and heavier vehicles. That perhaps goes some way to explaining why the new airborne vehicles we saw at the parade look a bit heavier and chunkier than the old Type 03. In this case, we saw 3 distinct vehicle types, again seemingly based on a common chassis. There was what looked like an IFV-style variant with an autocannon armament, active protection system, missile system and a bunch of sensors. A dedicated APC variant that appears to sacrifice firepower, potentially for more internal volume for additional troops. And finally, what appears to be a gun-mortar variant. Think an airdroppable artillery vehicle in the style of the Russian 2S9. As at time of recording, I haven't seen Chinese media release designations for these vehicles. But I do think it's interesting to look at these vehicles and the Chinese decision to show them off in the context of some of what we've seen out of the war in Ukraine. There, Russia's airdroppable AFVs have had a very difficult time. As lightly protected vehicles packed the gills with ammo, they tend to blow up a lot. From an engineering perspective, in order to make a vehicle that you can airdrop, you have to make some pretty stark sacrifices. In the context of the war in Ukraine then, where Russia's paratroopers have spent the overwhelming majority of their time acting as elite infantry, not jumping out the back of helicopters or cargo planes behind the lines, there's an argument to suggest they would have been better off if they'd been issued with heavier stuff like BMPs from the very start. Looking at these Chinese vehicles, if they are airdroppable, it's doubtful the armour is particularly thick. But you can still see signs the designers might have invested effort in trying to reduce that vulnerability at least a little, with the big difference being the mounting of that active protection system. That might not stop the vehicle being penetrated if it is hit by an anti-armor munition or something like an FPV drone, but it might be enough to stop the first or second attempt actually making it to the vehicle in the first place. Regardless of how the Chinese GL6 APS ultimately ends up performing, I suspect that when it comes to future armoured vehicle design, we'll see more and more reliance placed by designers on these kind of active systems. Whether you're talking about drones and loitering munitions, indirect fires, or top attack munitions like ATGMs, it's increasingly clear, I'd argue, that if you want to design an armoured vehicle that's survivable on a modern battlefield, it's not enough to just protect the front. You need to worry about protecting all hemispheres, and if you try and do that just with slabs of passive armour, the weight tax might just not be workable. APS obviously have their disadvantages, they can be expensive, and I've never seen a slab of armour plate run out of ammunition. But what we saw at the parade certainly seems to suggest that the PLA sees some serious potential here. There were other vehicles that were showed off we could go through, including a full suite of amphibious armoured vehicles, but by now that's probably enough to make out a couple of common themes. A lot of the armoured vehicles we saw tend to belong to common families with multiple variants, place an emphasis on tactical and strategic mobility, incorporate active defence systems, and often significant sensor suites, unmanned turrets, remote weapon stations, and a variety of similar features we've seen pop up in a lot of Western next-generation AFV concepts, but not necessarily make their way onto a huge range of vehicles that have actually reached mass production. Not every vehicle shown had those features, obviously. The wheeled amphibious vehicles we saw, for example, seem to incorporate manned turrets and no obvious active protection system, but I'd suggest what we did see in terms of those features was notable enough. And in that respect, I'd argue we're seeing signs of Chinese armoured vehicle designers not just trying to keep up with global development trends, but also playing a role in pushing them forward as well. From a planning perspective, seeing vehicles like this also might have implications if you're a potential Chinese competitor. You may have to adjust your assumptions about where the PLA can project certain types of armoured vehicles, like main battle tanks, and how much combat power the units equipped with them can potentially bring to the table. A Type 100 slogging it out with the likes of M1A2 Set V3 would be a very different proposition, for example, if it turned up in an area of operations where most of its opponents were lighter vehicles. Similarly, a new family of airborne vehicles, if mass-produced and deployed, would have a potential impact on the combat power of China's paratroopers, especially if those vehicles have an effective active protection system and are primarily dealing with opposing forces reliant on man-portable anti-tank weapons, think ATGMs or shoulder-fired rockets, that APS might be optimised to try and defeat. And serious investments in that area might demonstrate that Chinese military leadership still very much value the role they believe that airborne forces might play in any potential future conflict. Of course, as the war in Ukraine has arguably demonstrated, if you want your shiny new armoured vehicles, or unarmoured vehicles, or anything really to survive on the modern battlefield, you really need to have an answer for the drone and loitering munition threat, one that probably goes beyond just mounting an APS with a couple of shots on most of your armoured vehicles. And while Chinese forces obviously haven't been directly fighting that war, you'd expect the PLA to be very familiar with drones, the threat they pose, and what they can do. As of last year, the People's Republic of China was the largest global producer of civilian drones. The DJI Mavic has been an absolute workhorse of the tactical ISR function for both sides during the war in Ukraine, And even as Russia and Ukraine moved to ramp up their production of their own domestic drones, often that was with a significant input of Chinese components. The point is that through Chinese industry, the PLA has access to a lot of drone-related talent. And we've seen evidence that the PLA is leveraging that talent in two directions. By becoming a major adopter of military drones on one hand, and understanding the importance of good counter-drones, so CUAS systems, on the other. And an observation I'd raise out of this parade and other things we've seen from the PLA is that when it comes to picking a technological winner, as far as CUAS solutions go, so far, it basically looks like Beijing has selected the all-of-the-above option. We saw a variety of new radars and sensors that might help detect incoming threats, electronic warfare systems that might be effective against a lot of drones, although obviously not those with things like fibre optic cable connections, and then a full suite of hard kill systems that might be able to deal with those more stubborn targets. We saw what appears to be a large high-powered microwave system, which, if you remember the episode on directed energy weapons, might be used to essentially fry the electronics of an incoming threat. China showed off various HPM systems over time, although given the size of the one on the right there, it would probably be more suitable for defending fixed installations or operating in rear areas than as a manoeuvring frontline asset. It's notably significantly larger than some of the systems we've seen showed off by the United Kingdom, the US Marines, or the US Air Force. But when it comes to the directed energy weapons, as with so many things, size can matter. And so all else being equal, you might expect bigger system to translate into bigger zap. One thing that really makes HPM stand out as a potential anti-drone option is they're essentially area of effect weapons. In Ukraine, you might see a lot of FPVs or loitering munitions attacking in ones or twos, but I think the expectation has to be in future that you'll see more and more drone swarms. Formations of drones talking to each other, acting together, and potentially overwhelming whatever sort of defences a target might have. With the HPM, you don't need to target an individual drone. You don't necessarily even need to be able to see an individual drone. You just get to pick an area of sky and declare it a drone-free zone. That sounds great, but it can't really be an across-the-board short-range air defence solution. For one, while it can be expensive, there are options to harden targets against HPM attack. And at the other end of the spectrum, frying the brains of a target system doesn't work if the target is sufficiently dumb. For example, good luck jamming the guidance system on an unguided shell or rocket. But a munition that might not care about HPM attack might still care about bits of it starting to melt, which is where the PLA's high-energy lasers probably come in. Just as with HPMs, China is believed to have a variety of HEL systems either in service or development. They've exported laser systems, including to Saudi Arabia, and there is video out there claiming to be of at least one Chinese laser system being used against Ukrainian drones in Russia. Compared to HPMs, lasers can only engage one target at a time, plus they can be a bit picky when it comes to weather conditions, but because they're imparting thermal energy, they can potentially be effective against a wider array of targets. There's a reason the US Army wants to use a mobile laser system to shoot down incoming artillery rounds, not a HPM. At the parade, China actually showed off multiple laser systems, so you can see a lighter example on the right there, but the one I really want to focus on here is this thing, designated the LY-1. According to Chinese media, this somewhat beefy laser system is primarily intended for naval use. Ships generally make pretty attractive directed energy weapon platforms, because factors like weight, energy generation, and cooling are likely going to be less of a problem for them than they would for something like an aircraft or an armoured vehicle. And in that respect, LY-1 would fit in pretty well with some of the other naval laser programs we're seeing experimented with around the world. Think Dragonfire for the United Kingdom, or Helios and other programs for the United States Navy. But the way this laser was displayed has led some analysts to suggest it might be intended for ground use as well. If Beijing just wanted to show off the emitter, then like some of the naval weapons we saw elsewhere in the parade, it would have been simple enough just to stick it on the back of a truck and call it a day. While this vehicle you can see it displayed on appears incredibly large enough to mount the kind of generators and systems necessary to actually operate a laser. That wouldn't be without precedent. Multiple nations, including Israel and the United States, have tested mobile laser systems, but this would certainly be on the larger side compared to the likes of America's Stryker-mounted DE SHORAD. Obviously, with a large unarmoured vehicle like that, you're probably not looking at a system you'd expect to see doing donuts near the front line of Donetsk. But defending high-value infrastructure, or targets well behind the front lines, maybe. But if you're in a scenario where the Star Wars solution to your CUAS challenge won't work, there's always the old-school method of hitting something with high-speed bits of metal until it stops moving in ways you don't want it to. To that end, we saw a bunch of kinetic CUAS options running all the way up the spectrum, from APS and RWS on the regular armoured vehicles to dedicated SHORAD platforms. That included rather typical self-propelled anti-aircraft gun concepts, where you have a gun system paired with the radar and other sensors necessary to point it where it needs to point, but the modern trend for some time has been to often pair a gun system, which might have the advantage of things like flexibility and cheaper ammunition, with one or more different types of missile system, both larger ones that you might use against targets like fixed-wing aircraft or helicopters, and then also smaller, cheaper ones that you might use specifically against small drones. To illustrate, I've got some examples up on the right there, including a Russian Pantsir and a version of the German Skyranger 30. And the US has systems like Vampire, which has been exported to Ukraine, which gives you a ground-launched options for the APKWS guided rockets. For their part, China showed off this thing. This is a wheeled vehicle, which has been commonly referred to as the FK3000, which, just like some of the other systems out there, combines a gun with anti-drone missiles, the difference being it's a lot of anti-drone missiles. In total, the vehicle mounts 24 box launchers, and while it's difficult to see from that photo, up close, it looks like each of those boxes is divided into 4 launch cells, potentially giving every vehicle a magazine of 96 missiles on tap. If you think you might be defending against 1 or 2 drones, 96 interceptors per vehicle is probably overkill. But if you anticipate a future battlefield that's absolutely infested with small drones and loitering munitions, then maybe that kind of loadout starts to make sense. So what does all that mean, and why does this potentially matter? I think the big point here is that China is very clearly taking the drone and loitering munition threat very seriously. They're not just coming up with one countermeasure, they're coming up with a bunch of them, integrating them to different parts of the force, which, all else being equal, makes it less likely that the system has a single failure point, or the enemy is able to adapt to a single system and make the overall force vulnerable. The potential implication there is it might be more difficult for potential opponents of the PLA to rely on drones and loitering munitions as a kind of hard counter. You might see scenarios where drones are still very effective on the battlefield, especially as they continue to evolve, but if the countermeasures catch up and the other capabilities are there, they might not be as dominant as we see in Ukraine. From an investment perspective, there also appears to be a degree of risk mitigation and future-proofing going on here. Beijing isn't putting all their eggs in one particular CUAS basket, they're investing across multiple lines of effort and multiple technologies. Although obviously only time will tell how these various defence measures are deployed, how they work in practice, at what scale they're produced, and how well they can deal with not just the way the drone threat looks now, but the way it looks in 5, 10 or 20 years. As with so many militaries' counter-drone efforts, the investment and effort is very clearly there. The jury's just still out on how the technological and doctrinal arms race will play out. From little things that fly, I next want to pivot to big things that fly. Specifically, with a couple of notes about Chinese carrier aviation. While internet debates over whether or not the carrier is obsolete in an era of long-range drones, hypersonics, and anti-ship ballistic missiles will obviously rage on, the signals we're getting out of China definitely seem to suggest the People's Liberation Army Navy doesn't think so. And the theme I wanted to raise here is China moving from a country that has carriers, which is a pretty wide club that includes countries like Russia and India, to a country that has all the components necessary to put together an American-style carrier air wing. Because as a tool of effective power projection, the carrier itself is just one piece of the puzzle. Make no mistake, it's a piece that China now has and is likely to have more of in the future, with the Type 03 carrier in the water and the Type 04 reported in the pipeline, which might, by some reports, end up being China's first nuclear-powered supercarrier. But the ability of the carrier itself to affect targets is shaped by the kind of aircraft it operates. Like Russia's Kuznetsov, China's previous ski-jump style carriers, like the Shandong, were very limited in terms of the kind of aircraft they could operate. In both cases, you'd have one or more fourth-generation fighters, J-15 for China or Sukhoi 33 for Russia, for example, but a lot of the other jobs had to be done by helicopters. The Russians, for example, relied on the Kamov-31 helicopter for airborne early warning. China's newer, larger, catapult-equipped flat decks give them more options. All else being equal, you can launch fixed-wing aircraft with a larger payload if you fling them with a catapult rather than relying on the cope slope, and the type of aircraft you can operate full stop also widens considerably. And this parade demonstrated many of the elements that might make the future Chinese carrier air wing look a lot more like their American equivalents. The US Navy has a 5th-generation fighter, the navalised version of the F-35. China gave us a flyover by their J-35, the country's second 5th-generation fighter, and likely the first one to be carrier-capable. Like many of the other elements we've gone through today, this wasn't really a surprise to us. We've previously seen images, for example, like this one, of J-35s with production numbers suggesting that they're low-rate initial production airframes. and a very prominent shark motif on the tail fin, which is something we've also seen appear on China's J-15 carrier fighters. So J-35 making its way into the fleet wouldn't be unexpected, but it would bring China into the very elite club of countries that have a fifth-generation fighter on their carriers. The US Navy also operates a dedicated electronic warfare platform off its carriers, the EA-18 Growler, basically the EW version of the Super Hornet. But we've previously seen Beijing show off an electronic warfare version of the J-15, which China's Ministry of National Defense described back in November 2024 as being, quote, tasked with performing electronic warfare operations similar in broad form and function to the United States Navy's EA-18 Growler, end quote, thus expanding that naval aviation toolkit even wider. And then finally at the parade, we saw the public reveal of another carrier-based system. Unlike the Russians, who have to rely on helicopters for the job, countries like France and the United States have dedicated carrier-based early warning aircraft. In their case, that's the E-2D Hawkeye, which is obviously going to be able to fly further and mount significantly more powerful sensors than any helicopter. At the parade, the Chinese appeared to show off their entry into this carrier-based airborne early warning and control category. On the top right there, I have an image of the American Hawkeye, and on the bottom, the brand new and totally original Chinese KJ-600. Now, this may not be a case where the Chinese aviation sector wins any awards for originality, but I'd also say from a strictly military perspective, that's essentially irrelevant. Hawkeye is a proven design that works well, that's been flying from catapult-equipped carriers for decades. The first E-2s entered service back in the 1960s, and in its latest versions, it's still very much going strong. And so if you're a Navy that's moving into the world of catapult-equipped carriers for the first time, perhaps it makes a degree of engineering sense not to try and reinvent the wheel. Or in this case, reinvent the flying radar system that can deal with the rigours of carrier operation. The core point is that Chinese carrier air groups in the future are likely to have a fixed-wing sensor platform that they can launch and recover, with all the benefits in terms of awareness and command and control that kind of system brings. I think it's also fair to assume that future Chinese carrier air groups are going to benefit from a lot of the unmanned system development going on as well. China showed off a variety of quite large UCAVs, some of which incorporated stealth features and appeared designed for supersonic flight. That mirrors some of the developments we've seen globally towards so-called loyal wingman-style drones, or CCAs in American parlance, where you might have large drones intend to operate alongside the manned fighters. And indeed, while it's not linked to carrier aviation, they also showed off one other thing that I want to mention because it represents a kind of global first. This is the new two-seat variant of China's J-20 Mighty Dragon. There's a common feature across all the other relevant fifth-generation fighters out there, F-35, F-22, J-20, J-35, Sukhoi 57 for Russia if you're feeling generous. They're all single-seaters. I generally agree with a lot of the analysis out there saying this probably isn't for training purposes. China, the United States, and all the F-35 operators out there seem to have had no trouble training plenty of pilots on those platforms without a two-seater version available, but I can imagine plenty of reasons you might want to add a WISO, a weapons systems officer, to the second seat of a fighter like this one. If your intention is to have manned J-20s operating alongside a bunch of unmanned platforms, then you might get some benefit adding some two-seaters into a formation so you can have the second crew member help manage all of those unmanned platforms. Cognitive overload is a thing, and while sensor fusion and mechanical assistance might go some way towards alleviating the problem, the PLAF might be taking the view that sometimes the best solution to a problem is simply another pair of hands. The core point here is that whether you're talking about ground-based aviation or the carrier fleet, we're starting to see Beijing bring together all the pieces of a next-generation peer-level capability. A new generation of aircraft, drones to support them, missiles for them to fire, and critical enablers like AWACS, tankers, and electronic warfare aircraft to support their operations. The so what factor for the carrier fleet specifically is that China is quite predictably building up towards having a mature, diversified naval air fleet. One that has a lot of the same types of tools as the US Navy, and thus one which, over time, might have a greater and greater ability to project power overseas. Blue water carrier operations aren't a simple thing, and not the kind of national capability you can build up overnight. But China hasn't been building this capability overnight. They've incrementally pieced it together over the course of decades. It started with the purchase of a rusted-out old Soviet carrier that gave them an opportunity to practice the basics. From there, they first built a copy of the Soviet-style ship, then the Type 03 that went well beyond anything the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation has ever produced, and we should expect the next ships in the fleet to continue to push that evolution ever further. China's carrier force is still obviously a long way from being a direct peer of the US Navy, but I think the parade provides another bit of evidence of just how quickly they're narrowing that gap. And I half-jokingly expect that if you're one of the people in the US Navy whose job it is to lobby Congress for funding for the Navy's next-generation fighter program, demonstrations like this one probably make your job ever so slightly easier. In terms of why this might matter, while a lot of the public analysis tends to focus on the role of the Chinese Navy in any large-scale conflict against a peer opponent, that's not at the core of the reason I chose to give a segment over to carrier aviation this episode, rather than things like China's new air defense systems, or the various anti-ship missiles it showed off, both of which might be highly relevant in that kind of scenario. What carrier aviation might offer, however, that many of those other assets can't, is the ability to project power. We've seen for decades that whenever there's an event that pops up anywhere in the world that the United States wants to tip one way or the other, one of the tools it often turns to is the ability to cruise 100,000 tons of American sovereign territory off the coast of the flashpoint in question, and then use the presence of all that striking power to shape how events unfold. The People's Liberation Army Navy is still a significant way off from being able to project carrier groups around the world in the way the United States Navy can. But between new carriers, new aircraft, and greater experience operating them, it's clear they're getting closer to having that kind of great power tool available to them. And time will tell how that capability, and with it Beijing's ability to influence events in its region and beyond, ultimately evolves in the years to come. But as we get towards the end of this episode, I want to move the focus away from individual pieces of equipment and instead zoom out a bit and don, if you like, the defence economics hat. From that perspective, I'd argue debating the exact readiness or capabilities of any individual piece of PLA equipment is obviously important, but I don't think it should ever come at a cost of acknowledging the broader trend here. That in the 21st century, the PLA has been succeeding in modernising its equipment at an extraordinary rate. This is a force that in a relatively short period has gone from being reliant on derivatives of the Soviet MiG-21 to becoming the second country on the planet to design and mass produce a fifth-generation fighter. And while the transformation of the overall force clearly isn't complete yet, that wasn't Beijing's stated goal. Those tended to focus on a much longer timeline, modernising the force by 2035 and becoming a world-class military power capable of fighting and winning wars by 2049. And if we're trying to project how likely it is that the PLA is going to maintain momentum towards those goals, I think it's important to acknowledge some of the defence industrial advantages they're working with and what sets a country like China apart from, for example, Russia. If you're looking at the process of equipment modernisation in a very general sense, there's a couple of places that countries can encounter bottlenecks. If you want to do it with your own materiel, you need to have the technical talent necessary to develop equipment that works, the funds necessary to drive that process and then procure it, and then you need to have the industrial capacity necessary to build and deliver it. Fall over at any of those gates or any of the milestones in between, and you can run into trouble. Russia, for example, especially pre-2022, had a lot of military technical talent. It inherited a lot of know-how and infrastructure from the Soviet Union, and it's very clear if you look across a range of Russian defence projects that they don't have any difficulty coming up with interesting ideas and concepts. What's desperately missing is the funding necessary to actually refine those designs and the industrial capacity necessary to actually build them, especially without reliance on imported components. Meanwhile, if you look at various NATO states, there are plenty of designs out there that, in terms of their raw performance, are absolute world beaters. The technical talent is very much there, and compared to Russia, often there's going to be a lot more funding available. And so in some cases, the bottleneck and a major cost driver becomes industrial capacity. The US Navy, for example, has a fantastic submarine design in the form of the Virginia class. They want more of them, they're spending a lot of money on them, but the shipyards and contractors just can't turn the boats out as quickly as the Navy or Congress might want them to. That's not to say that every NATO design is a good one, that funding is infinite, or that industrial capacity is always a problem. But whether you're talking about submarines or 155mm shells, over the last couple of years, industrial capacity has often been a barrier to NATO militaries modernising or moving as fast as they'd like. Hence some of the serious investments we've seen in trying to rebuild the base. In the People's Republic of China, though, I'd argue, the bottlenecks are often going to be different. This is the world's largest manufacturing state, its largest shipbuilder, the producer of the majority of the world's steel, a country that dominates the refining process for many critical materials, and which routinely leverages massive economies of scale when it comes to turning out product. To give you a sense of scale here, by World Bank estimates, there are more Chinese industrial workers than there are Russians. All Russians. Compared to countries like the United States, Germany, or even India, domestic consumption makes up a smaller overall proportion of China's GDP, with more of it instead being made up of investments and exports. That kind of economic structure does come with potential risks. Compared to other countries, China is going to be more reliant on foreign consumers to soak up its production of goods. especially in cases where Chinese industries arguably move into a state of overcapacity. China is producing so many EVs, for example, relative to domestic demand, that it's causing price wars so vicious that they've drawn the attention of the central government and pushed Chinese manufacturers to try and export as many of their vehicles as possible. To oversimplify, in some industries, China's problem might not be that it doesn't have enough capacity to produce stuff, it might be that it has too much capacity. But while having a bunch of slack industrial capacity in the economy might not be great if the goal is to be as efficient as possible with your investments, it might be potentially very useful if at any point you decide you want to dial up military production. The same way we've seen some companies in Germany, for example, take advantage of excess capacity from the automotive sector in order to support the rebuild of Europe's military capacity. The high-level observation then here for China might be that when it comes to military modernisation, the difficult part comes earlier in the process. If you see Russia show off a new concept vehicle, it's a massively open question whether the funding will be there and the industrial capacity will be there to convert concept into combat power. But when you're talking about China, the defence budget has increased 13 times over the last 3 decades, and once they've successfully designed a piece of equipment and figured out how to manufacture it, the industrial capacity might be there to basically just hit print on the system the way that few, if any other countries can. I've got some charts on the right here from a CSIS report that can demonstrate how that might flow through in practice. As you can see in terms of hull count, the People's Liberation Army Navy is expanding extremely quickly, to the point where it now has more ships, albeit not tonnage, than the US Navy, and by some US projections might have as many as 50% more ships by 2030. In terms of its fighter force, China has been able to accomplish both modernisation and expansion at the same time. Per the IISS, in 2010, a plurality of the PLAAF's fighter force was second-generation aircraft. Less than 15 years later, fifth-generation fighters had been introduced, and the backbone of the fleet was now fourth-generation or better. So I'd argue that when China shows off new systems, it's worth paying attention. Because while not every idea will work out, perform as advertised, or be deployed at scale, when the PLA locks in on a system that they want to prioritise, Chinese industry can move quickly and at scale. Meaning that if you're a country that's a potential Chinese competitor, the critical question might not just be what is the PLA capable of today, it's what will it be capable of next year, in 5 years, or a decade from now. And as choreographed as they might be, parades like this one might give us just a little bit of insight into that precise question. There are obviously still plenty of question marks around how the PLA would actually perform if it found itself in a high-intensity combat situation. And as we repeatedly discussed on the channel, there are a lot of elements that go into the fighting power of a military beyond just the quantity and quality of its equipment. But through a defence economic specific lens, the PLA modernisation effort has a lot going for it, with a lot of the funding, human and physical capital necessary to get it re-equipped. And so unless something dramatic changes, I'd suggest that Chinese military modernisation isn't a what if, it's a how far and how fast. And okay, brief channel update to close out, because at this point my voice is starting to go. I'm aware it's a slightly shorter episode this week, but I didn't want to make it longer than it needed to be, and with it having been a very packed week, it also helped make things just that little bit easier for me as well. My plan at this point is, having talked this week about some of the stuff that China showed off, to next week pivot to some of what got showed off at DSEI in the United Kingdom, and with it, some of the concepts and technologies we're seeing showed off by other parts of the defence sector, particularly companies based in Europe, North America, or parts of the Asia Pacific. A major point I wanted to push forward this episode is that we are now a long way removed from the era where China was primarily a country that duplicated military technology from the Soviet Union or Russian Federation. It's now entirely capable of developing and fielding its own, in many cases, quite capable systems. But while developments are moving forward in China, the rest of the world is very much not standing still. And so next week I hope to give you a bit of insight into what some other nations are cooking up. Until then, thank you very much as always for your ongoing support and engagement, and with any luck, I hope to see you all again next week.